All right, I think we should be all set. You need to turn on your microphone, please.
Right. So, hi, my name is Kalesh, and I'm a member of the core OVN team here at Red Hat, and I will be talking about our one of our newest features in OVN called mining aging. So, I will start with explaining what even mining is, just very briefly, so you have an idea why do we need it in OVN at all. So then I move on to like motivation. Why do we actually need the aging mechanism? Then I will talk about some solutions that we have considered, how to implement that. Then I will do a slight sidetrack, and I will show you some measurements that we did when we considered the solution. And then I jump back to the current solution that is implemented, and some final thoughts what we can improve in the future. So starting with binding even is and why do we need that? So if you consider this very simple topology that we have, so you have just basic east-west traffic. So you have server that is defined in OVN, and you have a client that can be basically anywhere outside. So it is connected to OVN through some external network. So if you send some request from the client to the server, it will just go through the external network through OVS bridge, and locally it will arrive at the gateway, and the gateway forwards into the server. So far all good, right? So, but the problem, well, not really the problem, but well, when the traffic goes back, so this server replies, it will go to the gateway, but the gateway doesn't necessarily know the MAC address of the client. So that's basically where we need the MAC binding. So what we do is that the router will send ARP request and ask for the MAC address, and once it gets the response, it will save that in the table. So that's called the MAC binding. And from that point forward, basically any time the server sends anything to the client again, the router doesn't need to look up or doesn't need to send the ARP again, and it will just use this table and forwards it to the correct MAC address. So here you can see just how the MAC binding row looks like. The important point, things in the table is the IP address and the MAC address. So you have this pair stored, and yeah, that's basically what the MAC binding is in the OVN. Right. So why do we even need the aging, and when do we need that? So the problem is when we have like some large scale environments. If you consider the topology that I showed you is just really simple, but on a scale, it can happen that the outside network has a lot of machines on that, and basically currently the problem is that the MAC binding table can grow infinitely, right? Because we store the MAC bindings forever. Well, what we do, we just, if we see for the same IP address that the MAC address changed, we can just replace that in the table. But once the row is in the table, we don't do anything with that, so it stays there forever. And when you have a large topology or topology that has many changes, like it recycles IP addresses and MAC addresses and so on, and does it in some rapid way, the database can grow. And as we have heard today multiple times, like size of the southbound database matters a lot. So yeah, we want to do something with that. So if we go to the solutions that we have considered, the first thing I have called like idle edge columns. So the idea would be that the MAC binding would have some column that would store the idle edge. So what is the idle edge? Basically, the open flows have statistics, and one of the statistics is the idle edge. And as the name suggests, it tells us basically, if there was like recently any traffic passing through that open flow, so we can use this, and we basically know that this open flow is used. So that means in turn that the make binding is used. So basically, the plus side of this approach is that we don't remove any make binding that is currently used. Another plus side is very straightforward to implement. However, there is a price with that. So on the downside, this is possible source of race condition. So if we consider that basically the idle age is different for every OVN controller, because like the different hypervisors have a different traffic. So if we want to store the idle age in the database, this is possible source of a race condition, because multiple controllers might want to write something because they see, oh, my idle age is lower than the current one in the database. So that's pretty bad. And also, again, southbound database. So if we have multiple writes, like in short time window, it's a huge problem because we need to send the updates to the other controllers. So we are creating a lot of traffic in the southbound database. So we are basically slowing down everyone else. So if we move to another solution that was considered, that's what I call validating flows. So we would install some flow before the make binding that would basically just send an update to the controller that basically the flow is still in use, right? So it is more or less, or not more or less, it is a very similar concept to the previous one. So again, the plus side is that we wouldn't delete any make binding that is currently in use. And also, I didn't mention it before, but there is also a concern that if we are fetching the statistics, we need to do IPC with OVS. And that is also like, it doesn't come for free. So there is also some price in the IPC. So this would help to avoid us the IPC. However, I would argue that this one is even worse than before, because now we have another problem as a downside. So for the previous ones, we have the race condition, because the OVN control still needs to write something in database. We have still the high potential or southbound DB, because we don't know like when the updates will be sent from a different controller. So we might update the southbound DB at the same time from different controllers. And also, if we introduce like a lot of controller actions, that is not very healthy for the flows as well. So if we can avoid that, we should. So the third idea, and this is actually the first iteration of the make binding aging that was posted on the upstream mailing list, is that basically we would have something like an owner. So as I said, when we don't have the make binding, we send the ARP and we get the response from the ARP. And the controller that sees the response from the ARP is responsible for writing it into the database. So the idea was to basically the controller that writes the make binding into the database will become an owner. That might sound like a good idea, because now the race condition problem goes away, because there is only a single controller that takes care of the make binding. And it is, again, it is very easy to implement. But there is a problem with the traffic, because the controller that created the make binding row might not be necessarily the one that basically which hypervisor is passing the traffic. So we might end up in a situation that one controller created the make binding, and it is just sitting there, but the flow for this particular make binding is actually happening on a different hypervisor. And also the first idea had also the problem with the IPC communication with the OVS, because it was basically checking the idle age column to know when we have crossed the threshold of the make binding aging. as I said, I wanted to show you some measurements that we did. So I was talking about like disruptions to the traffic. So when we remove the MAC binding, basically the router, when he sees the traffic again, needs to do the ARP request again. This causes disruption in the traffic, and as you can see on the graph, so the top image is traffic that is not disrupted. It's just basic TCP traffic that is flowing from one side to another. And the bottom one is when we actually delete the MAC binding. The interval for the MAC binding removal is pretty short. It's roughly 20 seconds. So as you can see, the traffic is able to kind of get back to the previous point, but not really, right? It doesn't look very good. I have also basically the same scenario, but for UDP. And you can see it's the same issue. But this actually has showed us one thing, and it might seem absurd, but this has showed us that the traffic disruption is not that big of a deal, right? From this picture, this looks pretty catastrophic. If you ask me if I've seen that, I would say that there is no way we want to disrupt the traffic if it causes something like that. But one thing to keep in mind is that the interval was very short. And if we have 20 seconds to remove the MAC binding, I would say that this is a bad design and bad configuration. In the real world scenario, I would say that there is no way that you want to remove like the flows that you the MAC bindings that you consider odd even after minutes. I would say it might be tens of minutes or even longer. In that case, it shouldn't pose like it shouldn't be that big of a deal, right? So if we go back to the solution, so this is the actual solution that is implemented and merged in the OVN. So when we considered all that, we basically came to conclusion. Okay, so we want something single component that will take care of the aging because we don't want the race conditions. So we moved everything to Nord D because Nord D sees basically everything. So we don't have to like elect any owner, anything like that, right? And as we said, the disruption is not that big of a deal. It is still happening when we have it implemented in the Nord D because there is no way how the Nord D can know if the MAC binding is used, right? But this is easier to implement because we have basically single component in the Nord D that is checking the threshold over and over again, and it is looking for MAC bindings that are expired. There can be still an issue with the softband database. So if you consider a scenario when you bring up a cluster, I think it's a pretty typical case. When you bring up a cluster, you start to see some GRs coming in, right? And we basically write those GRs in the softband database. And what will happen, you could end up with thousands of MAC bindings that have the same timestamp. So we use the timestamp to know when the MAC binding was created. So we can basically delete it after certain threshold. So you could end up in a situation that you have thousands of MAC bindings that were created within a span of multiple seconds, let's say, right? And that can be an issue because if you set the threshold for like, I don't know, 60 seconds, something like that, and the MAC binding aging kicks in, you can realize that Nord D is trying to delete thousands of those rows because they were created in a short amount of time. So basically what we did, so there are two important things, right? So the first one is like you can for the configuration, let's say, first one is you can configure the MAC binding aging, and we didn't like stop at that. We said, okay, it might be even more useful to configure a logical router instead of like globally, because some routers you might know that the topology is fixed enough that there won't be any changes, and you want to keep those MAC bindings forever, basically. So we made a configuration per logical route. You can configure the threshold. The threshold is configurable in seconds. The MAC binding agent can be disabled and is disabled by default, so you don't have to worry if you upgrade that you will basically start losing your MAC bindings. And for the second configuration is for the problem I was talking about. So if you have multiple MAC bindings that are within the more or less same time frame, we have introduced something like called bulk removal limit. So you can configure how many rows the NordD will remove in one go, let's say in one loop. So if you configure it to 5, it will not remove more than 5 rows. So what it does is that it basically helps to even out this short time frame, and not even out, spread it out, this short time frame. So for most of those MAC bindings, you would receive the MAC binding again if it is active. So with this bulk removal, if you configure it, you will end up for those MAC bindings to be shifted, because we have like when you hit the bulk removal limit, basically there is 5-second timeout before the aging can kick in again. So you would basically delay it more and more until you find some balance in the cluster eventually, hopefully, right? That's the idea. Yeah, right. I almost forgot. So for the future, the most important thing that we need is some feedback. We need to know from the users if that's helpful and if we can improve it in some way. Some things like for future improvements that we have already discussed is basically we would like to avoid the problem of removing the MAC bindings that are used. So we want some mechanism. It is not clear like how to do it yet, right? There are just some ideas, but we want some mechanism how to avoid removal of MAC bindings that are in use. So we would need something somewhere, probably in the controller, to notify us that this MAC binding is in use. But we want it in a way that eliminates the downsides that I described in the previous solutions that they were talking about having it in the controller. We have also considered like an active approach. So if we see that the MAC binding is about to expire, we could send ART ourselves to just see if the endpoint is still active and is still on the network, right? So those are some things that we have thought about, but still we need to hear from the users if it's useful and if it's useful in this form, right? So it might be the case that we don't have to do anything like in addition, and it might be sufficient. I highly doubt that, but yeah, we still need the feedback for it. Right, and I think that's it from my side. So thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much for the presentation. That was wonderful. Now we're going to open up to questions. Do we have any questions? We have one back here. Fabio, you can go later. Please wait.
Do you think there's a way to measure the amount of disruption actively and adapt the expiry timeout dynamically?
You mean like for the users?
No, I mean in OVN.
Right.
Automatically in OVN.
There could be a way, like nothing that I can think of from top of my head, but there definitely could be a way. Something similar that we did when we measured it with the short intervals. We can do something similar. We can set up something where we try to put as much traffic as we can through the pipelines and just remove the MAC binding to see how it goes. and like setting certain thresholds to see how it behaves, right? One thing I would be afraid of is that it would be time consuming because we want to simulate something closer to real world scenarios. So like short time spans like thresholds like 20 seconds won't help us. We want something bigger.
Right. I guess I wasn't very clear. I actually meant doing it live in the deployment, so not for testing.
Right. Yes, I think that could be possible, definitely, yeah.
No virtual questions? Flavio, do you have a question? No virtual questions? No shot? Flavio? Anybody else want to go before Flavio? No?
Yes, please. Alex, this is awesome. I know a lot of people have been looking for aging your mic binding table for a long time. And Daniel Alvarez comes to mind. OpenStack folks. I guess my question is more on the sense of when you are doing the agent for the North D, now you're just riding to the southbound. You don't really have any ability to get the aging or any activity on the neck binding anymore, right? From the North D perspective.
That's the issue I was talking about. So we will still cause a disruption if the threshold is configured, right? But again, it shouldn't be that big of a deal if the threshold is configured to something reasonable.
Yeah. Cool. Do you have to deal with issues where the network is misbehaving? Let's say you send when we send an ARP, we get the same MAC response from multiple OVN controllers or things like that. Is there anything that affected your test that you saw? I've seen many cases where there's a misbehaving, bond or something that makes the MAC jump around like crazy and things like that.
Right. This can happen. Kind of related to that, we did one thing. We have realized there is a race in the OVN controller, but basically we get GARP from multiple places at the same time. We basically cause recomputes in the OVN controller, which is very costly operation. So when we noticed that should be also fixed in the newer versions. So this is kind of related to that, but not entirely. Yeah.
One last thing is, how about IPv6 and neighbor discovery? I think that's applicable here too, right?
Yes, because the MAC binding is universal across IPv4 and IPv6. So yeah, the aging works for both.
Perfect.
All right, I believe that's it for questions. If there's no more questions in person, we're going to